Good afternoon. So this is a session where we're looking at some of the other minor cannabinoids, and I'm assuming they're calling them minor cannabinoids just because on one part they didn't have the genetics of the original, I will call it cottage industry genetics on manufacturing things with more THC versus, some of the more controlled genetics that are happening now with gene splicing and everything else. So from that side of the point, you can be making more compounds that CBG is the major one versus saying it's a minor one. You'll have more people making plants that genetically will emphasize a synthase that makes other cannabinoids, the THCV or some of the other ones that are possible. So it's not so much looking at what we now term as minor. It's just more of looking at the rest of the cannabinoids that are biosynthesized or placed in a biopharma world where you're trying to emulate what a plant is doing. The second phase of this, when I look at the verbiage and whatever I was making up at that time, at that hour of the morning or night, was the cleanup of the mother liquors, which I'm sure that as we're looking through a process, I don't like the term mother liquor, but it is something that's used in the industry, so we'll stick with that. But it's also looking at, as you're moving through a process and you're doing one single stage of distillation to take off the higher volatiles, and the next stage to take off the next level of volatiles, and on temperature, you're eventually left with material that you're collecting, and you're left with material that's waste. And I've seen in my world, which I probably ought to explain who I am eventually with the other panelists, but in my world, I've seen a lot of material that's out there that's sitting in 55-barrel drums in Kentucky or Oregon or some other place where they can't ship it across state lines because it's probably got 6% THC. Maybe that shouldn't ship across state lines, but it's also considered waste. And so I do have a few comments on that. So we'll start off with a little bit of thoughts from the panelists and who the panelists are and what kind of thought processes, what kind of things that they're interested in and what kind of things that their expertise is in, so that we can be able to align questions with that panelist. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people, and an odd one would be 8. So on that side, I will. I won't introduce the panelists. I'm pretty good at knowing what I can do and what I can't do, and one of them is introducing people in a way that's complementary or functional. But I will. So my name is John McKay. I worked at Waters Corporation for 29 years. I got off with good behavior in 2017, and from there moved into the industry of cannabis. I spent my last 5 years there working in the cannabis industry for extraction by CO2 and CO2 plus co-solvents and different functionalities, and really just moving through a time when a 5-liter or 10-liter was all you needed, because the market was quite small. There weren't that many states, and then the technology has moved further as we've moved towards the Farm Bill and moving towards other extraction. And then within this time, helped out with the early days of a magazine started here with terpenes and testing. We thought that was as good as it was going to get. And then Celeste one day gave me a call and said, I'd like to start another magazine. What do you think about starting one about extraction? And so I thought that was a good idea. And I just come out of, so I was just starting retirement. I thought I'd be editor of that. That was like a daily colonoscopy for me. It wasn't something that met my skill set as far as, hunting down writers and having them actually get things on time. So I spent a lot of 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. times writing articles for a deadline. And we thought about the magazine, and we thought about it, and we finally came up with a very clever name called The Extraction Magazine. And so that was the end of my editorial side. And so with that, if you would introduce a little bit about yourself, Megan, and what your current interests are.
Sure, thanks, John. So I got my PhD in chemistry at Indiana University in inorganic, I already said that. I focused on organometallic chemistry and anti-cancer drug research. And then I moved on to OSHA. It's a 17025 accredited testing laboratory. So I'm familiar with all of the testing instrumentation that you see in cannabis testing labs. Right now I work for a consulting company that does design and design build for processing and manufacturing in cannabis industry, as well as building out testing labs, picking out the instrumentation, things like that.
I'm gonna let you speak on your own behalf.
Sounds good. Hi, my name is Rob Wirtz. I'm the president and co-founder of Mock Technologies. So Mock Technologies is really a specialized equipment manufacturing and technology company focused on the hemp and cannabis industry. So what we do there is we have a really strong core focus on automation, product consistencies, really design our equipment around future compliance, and tie that all back to an automated control system. And we do everything in our facility in Port Huron, Michigan. So really my focus has been on trying to automate the technologies, trying to develop and commercialize new technologies for the industry. And that's what our plan is going forward.
Thank you. The king of extraction, Dr. Jerry King.
He always does this to me. I'm a native Hoosier. I was born in St. Vincent's Hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana on February 19th, 1942. So that makes me 79 years old. And I'm still going at it. I got 2 chemistry degrees from Butler and a PhD from Northeastern University in Back Bay, Boston. Most of my thesis work was in chromatography, in particular a short-term stint with a iconish professor in the area called J.C. Giddings at the University of Utah. And we were applying supercritical carbon dioxide for migrating macromolecules in highly efficient columns and that kind of thing. So that got me into the bug of doing primarily CO2 technology, which I continued throughout several industrial stints, and particularly at the USDA lab in Peoria, Illinois. And I thought I was retiring in 2012 from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, where I was a professor in chemical engineering there, doing, again, CO2 processing and something called subcritical water extraction. We did some work a little bit with hemp. And I think what I can bring to the panel discussion here is that background in chromatography. As we look at Delta 8 and we look at some of these conversion reaction products, either purposely reacted to yield a certain product or accidentally, this brings us into several areas for separation, such as chiral chromatography, more into the pharma thing. So with that, that's what I think I can contribute here today.
All right. So one of the things that as we look at the difference between a natural compound coming from the plant and one that's a degradation. And so when we're looking at and calling them minor cannabinoids, we'll talk about it in that fashion for this session. So when you have the plant itself and you have different compounds, I'm an organic, so I have a PhD in organic chemistry, so I can't stop myself from making molecules. And when you're looking at this molecule here, this molecule here with it is CBDA. And as we all know, carbon is black, okay? Hydrogens are white, oxygens are red. And what we did is we made a couple of the other carbons here blue. And they're special carbons because they have 4 unique groups around them, and therefore they have a specific stereochemistry that this compound has. In this case, I made the hydrogens green. And there's 4 configurations without having to do a PhD in organic chemistry that can happen. So this is called cis, where the hydrogens are on the same side in this compound. But you can also have cis in this direction, so the 2 hydrogens can go down. Now, before you start doing YMCA as a group, so you can also have trans, where they're opposite from each other, which is what that compound is showing. And you can have trans the other way. And so it's important to the body what it sees with these different enantiomers. And the reason that becomes important is because of flumidomide. Flumidomide was a compound, I believe it was a German compound, and it was used for sleep. And so in the late 50s, early 60s, it was used there, but it was also given to pregnant women to help them sleep. And what happened from that is the major compound was giving sleep, but the minor trace amount of another isomer was increasing an amount of poison in the woman's brain that was going through the umbilical cord and to the babies. And they were born without arms. They were born with just a hand here. It was horrific. And what happened at that point in time, they realized that the FDA around the world had to make a new regulation and how to be able to monitor all of the different effects of a small molecule, synthetically or whatever, or biosynthesized, a biopharma, or from a plant. And so from that, they call it enantiomeric excess. And every pharmaceutical company has to do that on all of the different compounds in a plant. There's 3 or 4 good communications that we have found where in the last 2 years, this work has started to come out on the cannabinoids. And looking at what we thought was just one cannabinoid is not the case. It's making other ones. And when the plant makes a biosynthesized compound, it's making a very specific isomer. Now CBC may be a little bit different, but we'll just look at the CBD because it's a hemp. So when we're looking at that CBGA plus CBDA synthase makes 99.999% of this compound, okay? That's different from if you're doing a degradation of CBD to THC. It will naturally go to delta 9. This ring over here will close and it will look like the other molecule. But when it does that, it has an opportunity to make trans, cis, or cis. It can make 4 different stereomers. That has not been tested as much in the human body. And so when we're looking at the difference between what the plant is making and what people are making synthetically, those are 2 very different compounds. So when you're looking at delta 9 that comes from CBD, that has a chance of being different compounds, and that's been proven out through high sensitivity mass spectrometry, as well as chiral compounds, as well as chiral chemistry, and so it's been proven out. Now, when you're looking at CBN, once it's CBN, it's locked in. I mean, it's not going to be changing, so you're not going to have as many isomers. So when we're looking at this part, and Jerry brings up a good point, no matter how you're extracting from the plant, you're taking the major molecules that the plant has made, whether it's ethanol, CO2, tetrafluoroethane, propane, butane, hexane, lipids. It doesn't matter how you're doing it, because you're taking the major components that come from that plant. And that's what each person can speak to. But when you're going to be able to say, what are we looking for as we're moving forward, you have to have the isolated compound in its natural form and then add other things to it as you're doing science to be able to choose the validity. So with that, I mean, there's enough questions that come up from that, but I'll stop for a second and see if there's any questions from the audience before I move forward to the panelists. If I was to give a grade on 1 to 3, how many understood anything that I just said? Well, that's discouraging. So when I go back through, I will say that it's a variety like an apple. I have granny apples. I have delicious apples, separate from being an apple that's delicious. I have Macintoshes, and each one is used for a different thing. So you have different varieties that you're using for different products, so it's formulation-centric. So with that, I will bring out a question as far as Megan, and that is, what are you seeing as far as the research and the isomerization, and in your opinion on what we're doing with Delta 8, Delta 9?
Thanks, John. So if you're unsure about all of these chemical terms, the overall picture is we keep saying Delta 9 THC and Delta 8 THC, thinking that they are one single compound. But that one single compound branches out to make 4 different compounds, 4 different types of Delta 8 THC. And a lot of people who are growing hemp and isolating CBD, pure CBD, and still trying to make more money and synthesize Delta 8 or Delta 9 THC out of that, realize that there's a lot of side products and a lot of reagents left over, and you can't control what isomers you are making of Delta 8 and Delta 9 through that process. And we don't know how those individual isomers are reacting in the body. So if you see a lot of Delta 8 products coming out because it's more popular these days, just be aware it might not be safe and it might not be tested properly, because testing labs are not required to test for Delta 8 THC. They're not required to test for individual isomers of THC or Delta 8, or even different isomers of CBD. CBD also has 4 different types of isomers. And if people are synthetically modifying those molecules, testing labs cannot ensure that they are safe for your consumer. So just be aware of that.
So even as I'm going, so questions for Megan? Yeah. I do think that,
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, if there are different types of Delta 8, not all of them are safe, then why do people promote Delta 8 at all?
There's a reason why there was a question of Willie Sutton, and that was, why do you rob banks? It's where the money is. And so for that side, part of it may be naivete, and the other part is not saying that it is unsafe, only that it's untested in its current isomeric form that typically a pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical company would do. So I'm not saying it is unsafe, I'm only saying it's unknown. Besides, the plant's synthetic plant, Delta 8, has been tested all the way back from 1974. They've been testing that as an analog of delta of the THC. I'm just saying that the more recent synthetic reaction routes may be unknown. So on Rob's side, it's when you're looking at the extraction, because you've done a great job building a company that's doing good work with the hemp. How do you see the extraction side of it on some of the minor cannabinoids, not just the delta 8 and other things, but how do you see that in your world and what your experience has been?
Sure. So yeah, great question. So the most common equipment that we see would be like column chromatography equipment. And what I see there and what I like about that style of equipment is two phases. One, with that type of equipment, you can use the same processing equipment for THC remediation or pesticide remediation as you can for minor cannabinoid isolation. So if you change the media and the particle sizes inside of that column and you change the solvent conditions, which typically would be, let's say, methanol and water, you can then isolate and separate out minor cannabinoids out of that input stream to really get whatever target compound you're going after. So it allows you, and especially in new markets where they're growing and they have the potential to produce hot crops, that's a really nice advantage in my eyes because it allows you to do remediation, pesticide removal, and minor cannabinoid isolation there. So I think that's a great technology for that. And I think targeting certain minor cannabinoids that you know of today and want to target, and it gives you flexibility to change potential media and change solvent conditions to target other minor cannabinoids in the future. So it gives flexibility going forward. So that's the type of equipment that I most commonly see to perform that type of process.
So, and I would say that one of the things that I agree with and how you stated it was nicely, and that is you're able to change what your subjective term is of remediation. If you're looking for the isolation of different components, then your remediation is of one that you don't want in. So that could be remediation of CBC or CBN, or you could be isolating things. And so those are the other possibilities. I think that the other part is that it's solvent agnostic, and how do you make sure that you don't have residual solvents that unintentionally you're now putting back into a mixture? Sure. I think that's one of the questions I have.
Yeah, no, another great question. So typically with methanol and water, the first stage of after the process, when you have the solvent and separated oil mixture, should I say, the first part of that recovery process is pretty typical to even like cryogenic ethanol. So you use either a falling film or a rotary evaporator, some evaporation method to separate out the oil from this incoming solvent. But then you have a solvent mixture that would be, let's call it methanol and water, and that's more difficult to separate. So typically that's done in like a fractional distillation method that will actually separate out the water from the methanol so you can recover that methanol, remix it with water to produce what solvent you want on the front end to reintroduce to another batch in the chromatography column. So it's got an additional step, I would say, John, but it's not difficult as long as you get set up with, let's say, the proper equipment to perform the process and you know what equipment that is, so you're set up correctly from day one.
So I think some of the traditional, let's see if I can rephrase it, some of the traditional liquid chromatography is available, no matter what the media is, whether it's ion exchange, normal phase, or whether it's reverse phase chromatography. But then you also have simulated moving bed. You've got countercurrent chromatography. You have, I would say CO2 is just another phase of supercritical. And the man that Jerry studied under, Giddings, Dr. Giddings, he died at like 43 or 44, didn't he, Jerry? He died very, very young. And he had phrased CO2 as a dense gas because it wasn't like gas chromatography, because gas chromatography was the only way of doing chromatography back in the early 60s. And then liquid came in, but he had really invented the best means, and that was he called it dense gas. And you were there at the time. And so on that side, what else do you see on as other choices, Jerry?
Well,
Dr. King, sorry, the king of extraction.
yeah. Basically, you know, given the complexity of the matrix that cannabis or hemp things, a lot of things can happen to our ideal molecules, the delta-9 THC, CBD. So aside from the synthase, you know, to produce the original molecules, what I have here is just a couple of comments. When delta-9 THC converts either accidentally or you purposely synthesize it, delta-8 is a more stable isomer, actually.
Yes.
So it drives that equilibrium. And it turns out delta-8 is about roughly 50% less psychoactivity than delta-9. And that might be desired versus the strength of delta-9. But this occurs under strong acid conditions. I might just make an insert in here for CO2 technology. There is a whole area of CO2 technology, supercritical, that involves reaction chemistry with enzymes, et cetera. And also in the presence of water, you have carbonic acid, which is a weak material. So this might be an interesting thing to look at is, you know, this synthesis of delta-8 in supercritical media. But then you have this isomerization of delta-9 to delta-10 THC. Again, as the gentleman said here, these are diastereoisomers, and they can be fully separable with the appropriate HPLC conditions. There's also been a report here of it being done by distillation. And so you have all these conversions. For instance, delta-10 THC can isomerase to something that's a mouthful, delta-6A, 10A THC. And this, again, is done under acidic conditions. And so forth. And so looking at other transformations, you can have the chromatography of delta-10 THC and the delta-6A and TA. This is usually done by chiral chromatography. And of course, this leads you into the technology that the pharmaceutical industry does to separate out these separate things. So we're moving away a little bit from more empirical processing or chromatography technology into pharma level technology, as John and his colleagues at Waters have done. And then you can have the isomerization of CBD actually back to THC. There are conditions that exist there, and something called iso-THC, and some of these structures I'm not familiar with. You actually have an isomerization of CBD to what's called CBD-DQ, and there are a whole series of, I'll call them quinone structures that exist. And some of these can produce an array of quinone-type materials. And so one of the consulting gigs I had involved essentially monitoring the oxidative product from THC with the appearance of CBN in this case. So in this Canadian company, when they isolate their full spectrum or whatever purification level they have taken their THC do, they put it in freezers, and they then take grab samples, you know, in time to look for the generation of CBN in this case. So there are a lot of these, you know, spectrum of unknowns here, and they get into a complexity, you know, of different samples. But these are some of the conversions that happen accidentally in processing, or you can make them happen because you want a good yield to one of these other isomers like delta-8 or CBN or CBG. And most of them, you know, can be separated very effectively by chromatography methods. The SFC method can require a co-solvent such as methanol, maybe preferably ethanol, but they take you into the realm of fairly highly efficient, or what's the word, John? Unified, you know, chromatography separation.
Yes, unified chromatography.
Yeah.
Another Giddings. So, yes, sir.
I was going to ask a question. This kind of might come up later, but based on these different separation techniques, as a company interested in sourcing raw material to formulate with of the minor cannabinoids, take CBN for instance, could you speak slightly on the distinction of what the raw material may be when a company claims to have, say, a CBN distillate that's high in CBN versus a CBD distillate that then fortified with isolated CBN. Or if it's always the case that you're just using isolated miners to fortify a raw material.
The first thing would be, I'll let the panelists go because I'll intervene. And I don't have a very strong personality, but once in a while I pushy. You guys have an opinion?
Well, as far as adding minor cannabinoids, whether you extracted it separately and isolated it and then added it back in, it's the same molecule. But if they had synthesized it separately from base things, again, you don't know what are the side products, what's the total ratio of any sort of isomers that might be possible. CBN doesn't have those isomers, so you don't have to worry about that for that case. But if you extract from the plant, then it's the same exact thing, kind of like adding terpenes back in. They're the same molecules whether you extract it from this and combine. So it's just a matter of whether it was from the plant versus synthesized that you have to care about.
Would you say that's the most common practice then for people producing this raw material for formulation?
I'd go to Rob.
I guess I don't know if I would say that's the most common. Yeah, that's kind of a difficult one. I would say it's probably not the most common in my opinion. I know some people, I mean, when they take this and you want to do the isolation, you want to separate it. If you have a high CBN distillate, should I say, and you want to separate that out and isolate that from the other cannabinoids, I would say, again, Dr. King might have a different opinion about the method of it, but I would say that if you process that through a nice chromatography system, you design the media and the co-solvent correctly, you can get a really good separation. As long as you get those particle sizes correctly so you can get those peaks to be skinny and tall peaks. So obviously you want to see when you separate those, you get a clean separation of your finished product. If you have the peaks being skinny and tall and you have flats, let's say, between them, then it leaves, let's say, a solvent layer there that will allow you to separate that and get a very clean end product there.
So the CBN, the blue carbons are now black. And that's why there's no isomers. There's no chirality. It's totally saturated as a separate phenyl group.
I might comment here. I mentioned this Canadian company. The delta 9 THCA, say in the acidic, form, goes to an intermediate CBNA product, and that's caused by exposure to light, oxygen, which is very frequently done in the processing of real world hemp or cannabis substrate. Then when you heat it above 100 degrees centigrade, you get the decarboxylation, which produces a CBN. So it's this oxidation by light and storage at room temperature, and hopefully you can avoid it by doing it subambiently storage that produces a CBN. Whether you intended for it to be that way or not, that's how it comes about. And a comment about analytical chromatography, there's been some terrific work done by particularly instrument companies like Waters and so forth on separating 9 or 10 cannabinoids, usually with silica-based columns, which are expensive raw material to scale up on and so forth, versus crude adsorbents like alumina, etc. But when you scale up those nice thin peaks, you get into what's called an adsorption isotherm. And they start to skew and they start to merge. And you can use a technique called peak shaving, which leads you into a continuous system like the rotochrome, or what did you mention, John? The simulated moving bed, So SMV is very good, and it's been shown, in several industrial applications where you have a binary or a 3-component material you want to separate, But you have to remember that once you scale up, those beautiful analytical separations start to congeal,
Yeah, it's like driving your Miata down the highway and then driving in my case, a 1996 34-foot Winnebago Adventure. And headlines and things like that. So you have to be careful when you're scaling up and it's controlled. We have about 5 minutes left, but go ahead.
I did want to add, going off of what Jerry said, it's not just people synthesizing compounds with CBD. It's also product storage of your CBD compounds. So it's good to not only test your products right after you've made them, but test them after 3 months, after 6 months, after several years, because CBD is known over time with light, oxygen, heat to degrade into delta 9 THC, into delta 8 THC. So some people have been found to complain about a certain product that they purchase, even though it's said to be CBD only, and below the threshold, the legal limit of delta 9 THC, they find that they're getting psychotropic effects. And it could be because your products are degrading from how they're stored, or they're
area and the cold storage, non-lighted area. What's the shelf life?
There's studies that are written in forensic magazines, and a lot of them are open access. And so most people on the food chemistry side are concerned about that because they think about shelf life. I mean, a lot of USDA work that Jerry had done, Dr. King had done in the past, but it's the forensics work. So there's forensics work out of Australia way back in the 90s and such. So it can be years because they want to make sure that a sample that they've taken for someone that's being incarcerated is still viable when they go to court. The fact that it's 5 years, one would hope that you would actually be in court by then, but I can't speak of every country. So you look at that, there's some work out of Germany that's also been done. I don't know why Australia comes up first, because they were already inhabited by outlaws. That's how it was inhabited, but couldn't find any other place for people in Chicago to go. So, and they were mostly Cubbies fans, from what I understand. That may be untrue. Do you have any closing comments, Jerry?
We didn't say something about the isomerization of delta 9 THC to this delta 10 THC, which incidentally was found accidentally a couple of years ago in this processing. But the so-called delta 9 THC going to delta 10 THC, there are two isomers of delta 10 THC. They have radically different melting points, but they can be very nicely separated under appropriate HPLC conditions. And again, a plug for my old friend SFC. They can probably do. Basically, SFC chromatography is more efficient than liquid chromatography, but that gets into a lot of hand-waving theory and so forth. But I think there's a role on more preparative SFC coming down the pike in this area, whether you're going to delta 8, delta 10, in these other conversions that have been shown to occur accidentally, but you can also just hit your material with heat if you want to get a CBN rich product.
Rob, some closing? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
I was just going to kind of add a follow-up question, kind of off of what I had asked earlier. Based on the different styles of separation that you guys spoke on, when you're looking at, say, a CBN or CBG, it might be just your opinion, but what sort of things are you looking for to say, I'm proud of this product, either because of how it tests or the style of separation that you think is a quality market product compared to something that you would totally avoid?
Like, what would I give my grandmother or my child?
That's a good start, yeah.
Well, not myself.
Marketing versus safety.
Rob?
Here, I guess the part I can comment on there is if you're buying, let's say, crude material, if the material is not winterized very, very well, I would suggest you definitely have to winterize that material. And that's the reason, because if there's any fats and lipids in there, when you're putting it through, let's say the method I'm talking about, a chromatography column, and if you want to put a small micron size, whether it's 15 or 50 micron, if you have fats and lipids in there and that bonds to that media inside that column, that's going to change the amount that it can like grab on to some of these compounds that it's going through, and it's going to blur the separation. So I guess that would be something I would suggest, that for the product you're buying, I would make sure that if you're going to go through and put it through this process, that you either go through and do a really good winterization step, which, you know, there's a lot of people, including us, who could help with that process, but or make sure that it's tested and it's what I would consider a fully winterized crude product to put in. If not, you're not going to get what you want coming out, should I say?
I got the you have to stop now or I will, kill you. And so thank you very much for your time, and thanks for attending, and hope it was of value.